At exactly 6:51 in the morning on a pale winter day, when most of the United Kingdom was still swallowed in a silent blue fog before dawn, a message from the palace appeared out of nowhere. It was short, it was cold, and it was irreversible. In fact, it was so abrupt that even the most seasoned royal correspondents froze mid-sentence. The statement contained only a few icy words, but those words were powerful enough to shake the foundations of a centuries-old monarchy. The king confirms an official separation from Queen Camilla following the unauthorized leak of confidential medical files. 16 words. 16 devastating, clinical words that cut through the morning frost and signaled something the public had never seen in modern royal history. Within minutes, the headline flooded every phone screen from Edinburgh to Exeter. A factory worker in Manchester stood motionless beside a vending machine, tea turning cold in her hand. An elderly man in Brighton whispered in his dim kitchen, "So this is the point of no return." On a double-decker bus rolling through central London, passengers looked up in unison as the news alert chimed like a warning bell. But the shockwaves did not stop at Britain borders. Across the Atlantic, at 1:51 in the morning, CNN anchors blinked rapidly at the red banner flashing across the screen. On CBS, a sleep-deprived analyst clasped his hands together and muttered, "This is far worse than anyone imagined." MSNBC described the moment as the most destabilizing royal rupture since the chaos after Diane's explosive interview nearly 30 years ago. Yet, within the global uproar, the oddest detail was the timing. Royal announcements are never released at dawn. Unless the palace has lost control, a pre-dawn statement is not an explanation. It is a flare in the dark. It is the monarchy signaling that the story has outrun them. And this one carried the fingerprints of a crisis spiraling faster than the palace could contain. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was unnervingly still. Footsteps that usually echoed briskly down the corridors now slowed to cautious, brittle taps, as if even the sound might shatter the fragile reality settling over them. Senior aides gathered in the communications room, where the statement had been drafted only hours earlier. Some were stunned, some hollow. Others wore the dazed expression of people who had witnessed something collapse behind closed doors, something the world would need weeks to comprehend. Whispers soon circled among those who knew the truth. The announcement had been pushed out far earlier than planned. For 3 days, since a foreign journalist obtained unauthorized medical documents detailing part of the king's recent treatment, the palace had been scrambling in a silent frenzy to stop the spread of information that should never have left the most tightly controlled files. The internal audit had been urgent, forensic, inevitable, and the results, by last night, were impossible to ignore. Someone had accessed files meant only for the king's medical team and his most trusted inner staff. Someone had moved those files across borders, and someone within Camilla's own circle had either looked the other way or taken a far more active role than anyone wanted to believe. By the time dawn approached, the monarchy had no choice. They had to speak before the rumors spoke for them. William knew it, Anne knew it, and Charles, shattered and exhausted, understood it more painfully than anyone. What followed was a single sentence crafted like a scalpel. No accusations, no dramatics, just a precise, merciless line dividing what was once a partnership from what had now become a national crisis. A marriage severed, a monarchy destabilized, and a world only beginning to grasp how deep this rupture truly goes. The first signs emerged in late October, a time when the royal household traditionally began preparing for the demanding winter season, when ceremonies, state functions, and annual charities converged into a relentless calendar. For the king, this period required stamina and stability. Yet this year, both were in short supply. Charles had long been dealing with health concerns known only to the smallest circle of senior advisors. Treatments had been scheduled quietly, schedules adjusted discreetly, and while the public saw a monarch carrying out his duties with steady composure, behind palace walls the pressures were beginning to mount. His doctors urged balance. His advisors urged caution. Camilla urged something else entirely. Those closest to the couple noted the shift almost immediately. Camilla, once the steadying presence who helped Charles navigate the early turbulence of his reign, began to change. Her tone sharpened, her demands increased, and her desire to shape palace operations grew more urgent. Meetings that had once been collaborative became tense. Discussions that had once flowed easily became territorial. At first, aides assumed it was stress, perhaps exhaustion from a demanding schedule. But by early November, the shift felt less like mood and more like strategy. One senior advisor later remarked, "She began operating as though she feared time was running out." No one knew what that meant, but the palace was already on edge. Meanwhile, a separate pressure was tightening from the outside. American media, especially networks with older viewership, began circulating commentary that framed Charles as increasingly fragile and Camilla as the unofficial power behind the scenes. British commentators, by contrast, sensed a growing imbalance between Charles's public calm and Camilla's private assertiveness. The divergence was subtle at first, then unmistakable. In late November, the Foreign Office quietly relayed concerns that international partners were picking up on conflicting narratives about the king's health. In diplomatic terms, this was not simply chatter. It was a warning. The palace needed internal coherence, not fragmented messaging. Princess Anne reviewed the briefing first. Her jaw tightened. She knew that chaos within the monarchy rarely began with scandal. It began with cracks in communication. She also recognized something else. The tone surrounding Camilla was shifting, and not in her favor. William received the same briefing the following morning. Unlike Anne, he did not react outwardly. He simply stared at the folder for a few seconds, then placed it neatly on his desk. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft but unwavering. "We are losing control of the narrative." For William, the concern was not gossip, it was institutional stability. The monarchy could endure criticism, but not confusion regarding the health of its king, and certainly not confusion amplified by voices outside the palace walls. Against this backdrop, Camilla's behavior grew even more erratic. Staff reported abrupt decisions, late-night directives, and private advisors bypassing established channels. Some ceremonial arrangements were adjusted without consulting the appropriate offices. Heritage displays were altered, then restored, then altered again. Nothing catastrophic, but everything unsettling. Anne noticed every detail. She had spent decades guarding the integrity of the monarchy. "When small breaches appear," she said quietly during a private meeting, "larger ones are already forming beneath them." But the most alarming shift was not structural, it was emotional. Charles, worn thin by treatments and by the strain of maintaining a composed public face, began withdrawing into long contemplative silences. He paced more. He slept less. He asked aides to reduce briefings he once viewed as essential, and when Camilla pressed him for more influence in public engagements, he no longer responded with firmness. He responded with fatigue. Privately, one aide whispered a sentence that chilled those who heard it. "The king is exhausted, and exhaustion is when mistakes become dangerous." By mid-November, a different kind of concern emerged. The communications office flagged an unusual pattern in palace inquiries. A foreign journalist was repeatedly requesting clarification about Charles's recent absences and canceled engagements. The questions were unusually specific, the timing unusually precise. Someone knew something they should not. Someone had access to details that were never made public. And the palace, for all its experience managing storms, felt the air shift. Something was coming, something cold, sharp, and disruptive. Camilla sensed the shift too, but interpreted it as a threat against her position rather than a danger to the crown itself. Those around her noticed the defensiveness, the clipped tone, the growing distance between her and the senior royals. One evening after a particularly tense preparation meeting, a veteran advisor muttered under his breath, "This winter will not end without consequence." He was right. The silence was tightening. The cracks were widening. And deep beneath the palace floors, the foundations of a decades-old partnership were beginning to fracture. The leak that shattered the crown, The breaking point did not arrive with a public outburst or a televised misstep. It arrived quietly, as most royal crises do, through a single discreet email sent from a foreign journalist to a mid-level palace communications officer. The message was polite, almost eerily calm. It included two attachments and contained a question that, once read, sent a tremor through the halls of Buckingham Palace. Could the palace please confirm the accuracy of the enclosed medical documents regarding the king? The phrase alone froze the air. The attachments were scanned pages, faintly watermarked, detailing portions of Charles's recent treatments and physician assessments. The journalist claimed they had been received anonymously and that he was offering the palace an opportunity to comment before publication, a courtesy extended only in matters of enormous sensitivity. Within minutes, the documents were routed directly to the king's private medical office. The confirmation came almost immediately. They were real. How they had left the building, how they had crossed borders, how they had landed in the hands of a reporter 3,000 miles away was a mystery that would consume the next 72 hours. But the palace knew one thing instantly. This was not an accident. It was a breach, a violation, an intrusion into the single most protected realm of the monarchy, and it was catastrophic. The internal investigation began before sunrise the next day. No announcement, no briefing, just a series of urgent, tightly controlled meetings held behind locked doors. The palace's digital forensics team combed through access logs. Senior medical staff were interviewed individually. Every advisor with health-related clearance was asked to sign emergency disclosure statements. Princess Anne was briefed first. Her reaction was not shock, it was something colder. "Someone did this with intent," she said. "Someone wanted this out." William, briefed shortly after, said even less. He simply closed the folder, exhaled once, and murmured, "It narrows the field." Because there were only a few people with access to the records, very few, and most of them had served the monarchy for decades without a single breach, which left one unsettling possibility: secondary access. Individuals brought into proximity through private offices, individuals who did not answer to the palace directly, individuals who had arrived through Camilla's expanding circle. This was the moment the crisis shifted from alarming to explosive. The forensics team traced an access attempt to a device that belonged not to the core medical staff, but to an auxiliary administrative account associated with a private communications consultant who had recently been working with Camilla. The log showed brief access, a download, and a deletion. The investigator presenting the findings to senior staff paused before speaking the next sentence. "This appears deliberate." The palace fell into a suffocating silence. Camilla was informed in person. According to two aides present, she went pale, then defensive, then furious. She insisted she had no knowledge of the access. She insisted her advisor must have misunderstood his permissions. She insisted this was an attempt to undermine her position. But the palace was no longer operating on assurances. It was operating on evidence. Anne asked the question no one else dared. Why did someone in Camilla's private circle need access to the king's medical files? There was no answer. William's concern deepened into something sharper. Trust, once broken in matters of health, is nearly impossible to rebuild, especially when the breach touches at the head of state. Meanwhile, the foreign journalist, unaware of the internal crisis he had triggered, sent a second email, politely inquiring about the palace's response. The documents, he explained, were already being reviewed by legal teams at his network. Publication was imminent unless the palace provided an official statement. The monarchy was running out of time, and Charles, upon hearing the full scope of the breach, withdrew into a silence that unsettled everyone in the room. Then, after several minutes, and he said quietly, "This cannot continue." It was not anger. It was heartbreak. The leak had done more than violate privacy. It had broken something far more delicate: his faith in the woman who had stood beside him for decades. And in that moment, the path towards separation became not just possible, but unavoidable. The confrontation in the winter wing. The confrontation unfolded on a night so cold it seemed to press against the palace walls, tightening the air inside the winter wing where the king had retreated for clarity. The rooms there were quiet, insulated from most household activity, a place usually reserved for reflection rather than reckoning. But on this late November night, the wing became the silent chamber where a decades-long partnership began to fracture beyond repair. Charles had spent the entire day in meetings that left him hollow. Advisors spoke in careful tones and delivered updates with a firmness that barely concealed their distress. William, reserved and controlled, laid out the institutional consequences of the leak in terms so stark that even aides who had served through multiple royal crises exchanged uneasy glances. Every discussion circled back to the same truth. The breach had originated from Camilla's orbit. By the time Charles finally requested to speak with Vera privately, the palace had already braced for impact. Camilla entered the winter wing with a look that blended defiance and dread. She knew the atmosphere had shifted. She knew the staff were avoiding her eyes. She knew William had grown cold. What she did not yet know was the extent of what Charles had learned. He stood by the tall window, the frost outside clinging thickly to the glass. His expression was unreadable, but his shoulders carried the unmistakable slope of a man who had crossed into a different kind of exhaustion. "Why are we here?" Camilla asked softly. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a folder on the table between them, a folder she recognized, though she prayed she was wrong. "This is the full forensic report," Charles said, voice calm but stripped of warmth. "The one confirming how the medical files left this building." Camilla froze. She had expected accusations, but she had not expected evidence laid before her like an indictment. "Charles," she began, I told everyone. I had nothing to do with it." "It came," he said, cutting her off gently, "from someone under your supervision." The stillness that followed was sharp enough to slice the air. She stepped back, her breath tightening. "You are assuming malicious intent. You are assuming I orchestrated." "I am assuming nothing," he replied quietly. "I am reading what is in front of me." For a moment, her composure shattered. The veneer of confidence she had wielded for months gave way to something raw, something wounded. "After everything," she whispered, "you think I would betray your health, your privacy?" Charles looked at her then, not as a king, not as a monarch defending his institution, but as a man confronting a devastating possibility. "I think," he said slowly, "that you have allowed people too close, people who act in ways that compromise us both." She opened her mouth to argue, but he raised a hand. "And I think," he continued, voice thickening with emotion that he was fighting to suppress, "that I no longer know which decisions are yours and which are theirs." That was the blow she had not prepared for. Camilla's eyes filled not with sorrow, but with fury edged in fear. "This is William," she hissed. "This is Anne. They have always wanted to sideline me, and now you are letting them rewrite your judgment." "Do not," Charles said sharply, "turn this into a battle of personalities. This is about the crown. This is about trust." Trust, the word landed heavier than anything else. It echoed across the cold room, filling every empty space between them. Camilla stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You once trusted me more than anyone." "And I did," he said, his voice breaking in the past tense. "But a breach like this forces one to see what he may have ignored." She felt the shift then, not anger, not blame, but finality. "You're ending us," she whispered. Charles closed his eyes. "I am ending chaos. The monarchy cannot survive another winter of internal conflict. My health cannot endure another season of strain." "And what of me?" she demanded. He looked at her with devastating tenderness. "You will not be abandoned, but you cannot remain in this role. Not after this." Camilla's breath hitched, not a sob, a collapse. The truth was no longer deniable. The separation was not punishment. It was inevitable. And as she stood in the winter wing, surrounded by the cold stone of a police that had once embraced her, she realized something far more painful than the loss of influence or title. She had lost him. The decision that could not be unmade. The night before the announcement felt unnaturally long, stretched thin by decisions that had been postponed for far too many months. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was not frantic. It was resigned, heavy, almost ceremonial in its stillness, as though the walls themselves understood that what was about to occur would leave an imprint deeper than any public scandal or political misstep. Charles spent most of the evening alone, not out of isolation, but out of necessity. He needed the quiet, the dim light, the deliberate pacing of his private study to process the decision that the institution now required of him. The faint ticking of a clock, one of the few remaining pieces from his mother's private collection, echoed through the room like a reminder of the monarchy's long memory and unyielding expectations. The draft statement lay on the desk in front of him, rewritten so many times that the margins had become soft from repeated fingers' touch. The language was precise, as royal statements always are, Bomano, but this was different. It carried a finality that no amount of diplomatic phrasing could soften. The king, after consultation with senior advisors, confirms a formal separation from Queen Camilla following the unauthorized release of confidential medical information. Charles read those words again and again, each time feeling the weight of both the crown and his own heart pressing against him. He had loved her, that was not in question. But love within the monarchy had always lived in the shadow of duty, and now duty demanded something he had never imagined facing. At precisely 9:20, Princess Anne arrived for a private briefing. She did not knock. She never had to. Charles looked up, and the two siblings held a long, quiet exchange with their eyes before a single word was spoken. "Are you certain?" she asked finally. "No, Ace," he answered, "but I am resolved." Anne nodded, the faintest trace of grief flickering through her usually unbreakable composure. She placed a folder on his desk containing the formal timeline, when the communications team would release the bulletin, when legal staff would begin answering inquiries, when foreign offices would be notified through diplomatic channels. It was the kind of structure that had carried the monarchy through every crisis for decades. But tonight it felt like scaffolding around a collapsing beam. Shortly after Anne left, William arrived. Unlike Anne, he paused at the doorway before entering. He looked older than his years, the strain of the previous weeks etched around his eyes. "Father," he began gently. Charles gestured for him to sit, but William didn't. He stood, hands clasped, the way he always did when the topic cut too close to personal grief. "I don't want you to think," William said quietly, "that this gives me any satisfaction." "It doesn't, I know," Charles replied. "But the monarchy cannot withstand another cycle like this. Not with your health in question, not with the leaks, not with the instability." Charles lowered his gaze. "You fear I waited too long?" William hesitated. "I fear you tried to protect everyone at the cost of yourself." It was the closest he had ever come to criticizing his father, but there was no anger in his voice, only a son's ache. When William left, Charles allowed himself one moment, just one, to lean against the edge of his desk and close his eyes. The separation was no longer a theory. It was a reality gathering momentum. By 10:45, the palace communications team assembled in the restricted briefing room. They brought draft statements, revised response sheets, and a list of potential international reactions. No one spoke above a whisper. They all understood the gravity. The separation of a reigning monarch from his queen consort had no modern precedent. There was no handbook, no template. Shortly before midnight, Camilla was informed that the final decision had been made. She received the news in her private sitting room, not with an argument, not with disbelief, but with a silence so deep that even the aide delivering the message shifted uncomfortably. She asked only one question. "When does the world learn?" "At 6:51, ma'am." A small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she dismissed the aide. Later, she walked through her rooms in slow circles, fingertips trailing along familiar furniture, portraits, and small keepsakes from years spent shaping her place within the monarchy. She paused before a framed photograph of her and Charles taken shortly after his accession. They looked steady, unified, ready. Now that moment felt like a relic from another life. In the early hours of the morning, Charles signed the final version of the statement. His signature was steady, but his breath trembled. It was done. By dawn, the palace machinery moved like a silent tide. Communications officers cued the announcement. Diplomatic lines prepared for impact. Legal teams braced for a flood of questions. There was no turning back. The separation was not just an administrative move. It was an institutional reset, a realignment of power, a closing chapter. And as the first rays of cold winter light crept over the palace roof, the monarchy stood suspended between heartbreak and necessity. The world reacts as the crown resets. The separation announcement swept across the globe with the force of a winter gale, reshaping political conversations, dominating news cycles, and reawakening long-buried debates about the monarchy's stability. By mid-morning on 29 November, the entire world seemed to be speaking about the same thing. The king's decision to separate from Queen Camilla after the leak of his confidential medical records. It was no longer just a royal story, it had become a geopolitical tremor. In London, clusters of reporters gathered outside Buckingham Palace, speaking in hushed, urgent tones between live broadcasts. The gray sky above seemed to mirror the collective mood. Heavy, unsettled, expectant. Commuters slowed their pace as screens in shop windows replayed the announcement, accompanied by somber commentary from royal experts. Some viewers expressed shock. Others murmured that the break had been inevitable, but the overwhelming sentiment was simple. Something had fundamentally shifted. In Edinburgh, a BBC analyst described the move as the most consequential personal separation by a reigning monarch in the modern era. A commentator on Sky News observed that the tone of the palace statement was notably unembellished, carrying none of the phrasing typically used to preserve personal dignity. Instead, he said, it reads like a boundary drawn with institutional steel. Across the Atlantic, American coverage took on its own intensity. Morning show hosts on the East Coast replayed the timeline of events with a mix of disbelief and fascination. On CNN, a legal panel raised questions about the breach itself, calling it one of the most alarming leaks involving a head of state in decades. Older viewers, especially those who had followed the monarchy since the days of Diana, expressed sorrow at seeing Charles and Camilla's long, winding story fracture so publicly. But international observers were not interested only in the personal dimension. They were focused on the implications. Within hours, diplomatic offices in Washington, Ottawa, Canberra, and Brussels submitted formal requests for clarification on whether the king's health concerns would affect upcoming engagements or state matters. Government officials privately expressed concern that the leak revealed vulnerabilities in palace security infrastructure that could have ripple effects beyond the monarchy. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, the aftermath unfolded with a different rhythm, quiet, deliberate, and laden with emotion. William and Anne moved swiftly to stabilize the institution. Their steps were quick, purposeful, and synchronized in a way that spoke of long familiarity with crisis management. It was William who handled communications with foreign offices, reaffirming that the king remained fully capable of carrying out his constitutional duties. It was Anne who coordinated with ceremonial teams to ensure that planned winter events would proceed without disruption. Behind closed doors, however, both felt the weight of something deeper, the end of an era they had spent their adult lives navigating. As the palace shifted into crisis mode, Camilla withdrew to her private residence at Ray Mill House. She left Buckingham Palace quietly, without the escort or ceremony that had accompanied her movements for years. Her departure was deliberate, almost symbolic, a step away from a world she had spent decades trying to inhabit. Those close to her said she spent the drive in silence, staring out at the winter fields passing by in muted streaks of gray and green. At Ray Mill, she reportedly walked the length of the garden despite the cold, absorbing the reality that her role had been severed, not by scandal, not by public uprising, but by a breach of trust that had pierced the monarchy at its most vulnerable point. A source close to her later described her expression as neither angry nor broken, but hollow, as though she were still waiting for a part of the story to rewrite itself. Charles, meanwhile, held a brief meeting with his private secretary, then retired to the quiet of Clarence House. Those who saw him said he looked exhausted but resolute. He spent much of the afternoon reviewing state documents, fulfilling his duties with the steadiness expected of a monarch. Even as his personal life crumbled beneath the weight of necessity, he did not speak publicly. He did not need to. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the city's rooftops, William joined him for a private conversation. No aides were present, no notes were taken, but a single line spoken quietly by Charles reportedly echoed through those who later heard it. "We must protect the crown, whatever the personal cost." It was a sentiment that reflected centuries of inherited duty, spoken by a man who had just relinquished the presence of the person who once steadied him. And as night settled over London, the monarchy, stripped, shaken, but still standing, entered a new season, a season defined not by ceremony, but by recalibration, not by romance, but by resilience. The crown had reset. In the cold, a quiet aftermath of the announcement, the monarchy stands altered, its path narrowed, but sharpened. Charles moves forward, carrying both duty and loss, while the world watches a crown rebuilt under winter pressure. This moment will echo for years.